Good evening. My name is John Siebert. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Joanna Quinn to you tonight. From the content of the movie, you already know that we're entering very deep waters and talking about things that most of us do not even want to think about. Dr. Quinn is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and director of the Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Reconstruction at the University of Western Ontario. It's a fine university, just an hour down the road. I'm sure there's many good things happening there as well as in our universities here. Since 1998, Dr. Quinn has been engaged in research that considers the role of acknowledgement in overcoming the causes of conflict, which has the potential to affect long-term peace and stability. Her current research considers the role of traditional practices of acknowledgement and justice in Uganda, in the situation we've just seen in the film, and also in Fiji. I met Dr. Quinn about 2 years ago. She came here to Waterloo to participate in a conference put on by the Academic Council on the United Nations System. It was a conference that took place at Wilfrid Laurier University in March 2007. Her presentation was entitled, "If at first you don't succeed, try again. Transitional Justice in Uganda, Building Peace and Justice, and Lessons from Uganda." If you look at her publishing record, there are many more formal titles in her essays and books. But this one speaks to the dedication and the tenacity that she approaches this subject. We're very pleased that you're here today, Dr. Quinn. We look forward to your talk, and when she's finished, we'll have time for questions and answers. Dr. Quinn.
I told John he's about 17 feet taller than I am, so had to adjust things. I wanted to say a big thank you first to CG for inviting me to speak to you tonight, and thank you to John for your kind words. We've just watched a very powerful documentary that raises a lot of issues about Uganda and also about the issue of child soldiering. And what I want to do for the next few minutes is to talk about all of these things in the context of Uganda, where I've been working, as John said, since 1998. And although many of you are likely aware of the situation in Uganda, I want to start first by placing into context the story that we've just heard. So, Uganda, as you can see, is located in the Great Lakes region of Africa, between Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Sudan, just to the north of Lake Victoria. When Winston Churchill first visited Uganda, he thought it was one of the most beautiful places he had ever seen, and he called it the Pearl of Africa. And in fact, there's a really funny academic whose name is Tim Shaw who works in Uganda, and every time I see him on a plane or at a conference, he says to me, "When were you last in the Pearl?" And that's kind of how I think about it. Uganda's home to 56 different ethnic groups who live in a geographic area close to the size of Newfoundland, minus Labrador. Uganda became a protectorate of Great Britain in 1900, or at least parts of Uganda did. Within 60 years, however, all of the 56 different ethnic groups who lived there had signed treaties with the British. And in 1962, the British officially left Uganda. From 1962, at the time of independence, until now, Uganda has been racked with conflict. The country's first independence leader, his name was Milton Obote. He spent his first term fighting against the significant number of riots and armed attacks from all of the other ethnic, religious, and political groups who felt that he had inappropriately been given power when the British fled the country. I didn't mean fled the country, I meant left the country. They left willingly. In 1971, Obote was overthrown by his military commander, Idi Amin. And for those of you who were born after about 1980, you will have no idea who Idi Amin is, except if you've seen The Last King of Scotland. For those of you who were born before 1980, you'll know who I'm talking about. But Idi Amin is the man portrayed in The Last King of Scotland. Amin carried out a systematic campaign of torture, terror, and murder. He sought to get rid of everybody who stood in his way. He targeted especially those people who had supported Obote, and he also expelled the so-called ethnic Asians, Indian people who had lived in the country for many generations, seizing their homes and property. And it's estimated that somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 to 500,000 people were killed during Amin's time in office. Interim governments were appointed in 1979 and 1980, and then in 1980, as the result of rigged elections, Obote returned to power. And he began to target those who were seen to have supported Amin, and an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 people were killed. And you'll know if you've ever seen a population pyramid that the pyramid is meant to look like this, but in Uganda you can see actual chunks of the population carved out of that population pyramid because significant numbers of people were killed during that time. And the reason these are estimated numbers, I should say, is that nobody bothers to take a census in Uganda. So we don't know the actual numbers. We have estimated numbers from people like the US Census Bureau. So after Amin was overthrown, in 1985, a military council ruled for 6 months until it too was overthrown. And then in 1986, a military leader called Yoweri Museveni came to power. He and his troops had been fighting against both Amin and Obote since 1971, and he remains in power today, having rearranged the constitution approximately 6 times to legitimate his stay in power. But Museveni himself has faced considerable opposition from many of the different ethnic groups throughout the country, and 27 different armed insurgencies have risen up against him. One of the longest running and most devastating has been the conflict in northern Uganda, waged by the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Kony. And this is what we've just seen in the documentary. Since 1986, the LRA has abducted children to conscript into its rebel forces, the boys to act as soldiers, and the girls to act as sex slaves, as well as carriers of supplies and even as soldiers. Abducted child soldiers are forced to commit the most heinous acts of torture and abuse, often against their own families. And it's estimated that somewhere between 30,000 and 45,000 children have been abducted since 1986. This resulted in the phenomenon referred to in the film as night commuting, where at the height of the conflict in northern Uganda, close to 25,000 children living in northern Uganda walked for many miles each night to seek sanctuary in the relative safety of centers that were guarded by the Ugandan military to avoid being abducted by the LRA. At the height of the conflict, it was estimated that up to 1.8 million people, and that's 80% of the population in northern Uganda, were internally displaced within that region. And for some of you who don't know, internally displaced people are the equivalent of refugees. Refugees occur when they cross the boundaries of their own state, but for people who are displaced within their own state, they remain within the boundaries of their own country, and we call these internally displaced people IDPs. So at the height of the conflict, there were 1.8 million IDPs in northern Uganda. They were forced to live in camps for the internally displaced, and we saw some footage of those camps in the documentary. If you remember, there was a UN helicopter looking out over all kinds of huts called Ailuch, and people live close together in these camps. Although, as the documentary reported, Kony and the LRA have moved on from northern Uganda, the war is far from over. We have no idea how many LRA soldiers remain in the bush. Estimates range anywhere from 200 to 20,000, but we do know that the LRA is carrying out campaigns of torture in places like CAR. And a missionary friend of mine lives in Bangui in Central African Republic, and every day she sleeps with her bags packed, and she reports in to African Inland Mission, the mission agency she works with, because she may need to call for a rescue at any point because the rebels are continuing to wage their campaign of terror. Child soldiers are a complicated problem for states to deal with. I keep looking because occasionally I get on the wrong slide and then we'll all be in trouble. But the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which entered into force in 1990, defines a child as any human being below the age of 18 years. Under the convention, the governments who are signatories, including Uganda, pledge to prevent both the abduction of children and to ensure that children under 15 years of age do not take direct part in hostilities. To further solidify the effects of the convention, in 1994, the Secretary General of the United Nations appointed an expert, whose name is Graça Machel, to study the impact of armed conflict on children. And Machel made her report in 1996. In that report, Machel looked at methods and effects of recruitment, how child soldiers are used, and in what in the literature and among practitioners is referred to as DDR. And that is demobilizing child soldiers, demilitarizing child soldiers, and reintegrating them back into their communities, as well as other preventative measures. Now, she recommended specifically that a global sensitization campaign should be launched and that the UN should pursue what she called quiet diplomacy with governments and non-state forces to encourage them to demobilize child soldiers. She further recommended that peace agreements should include specific DDR measures and provisions, and that states that hadn't done so should ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And yet, child soldiering continues to be an enormous issue. The UN estimates that approximately 300,000 children currently serve as combatants in at least 30 different conflicts worldwide. Nearly 500,000 additional children serve in armies that are not currently at war, such that 40% of the world's armed organizations have children in their ranks. And as you saw in the film, it's not entirely clear how many child soldiers in Uganda remain in the bush with the LRA. Estimates place that number somewhere between 200 and 30,000. Yet the government of Uganda, through its military, the UPDF, the Uganda People's Defense Force, also has child soldiers in its ranks. And you can imagine that child soldiers are merely one part of the catastrophe that has become northern Uganda. That is, the physical infrastructure has been destroyed, and much of the population remains in camps for the internally displaced, which were once meant as temporary housing, but which are becoming much more permanent settlements, without electricity, without running water or adequate sewage treatment and that kind of thing. So programming for formerly abducted child soldiers, who are also called ex-combatants, is simply one of the things that needs to be put in place to begin to assist society there. And so what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to talk a bit about 3 of the ways the government is dealing with the issues of child soldiers in Uganda, followed by a brief account of what various NGOs are doing to fill the gaps left by government programming. Now, the government of Uganda clearly says that it is concerned with, and I quote, all aspects of social rebuilding after the conflict in northern Uganda, end quote. But what we know, in fact, is that government spending in the area of social and physical reconstruction in northern Uganda government spending on social and physical reconstruction in northern Uganda indicates that the government spent 0.01% of the national budget in 2004 and 2005 on those activities. So of its possible budget, the government spent 1/100th of 1% of its spending on social and physical rebuilding in northern Uganda, and child soldier programming is part of that. And as Machel points out in her report, children pay a heavy price when their governments spend their country's limited resources on defense budgets instead of programs that are of direct benefit to children. So one of the things that the government has done is to enact the Amnesty Act in 2000. And anyone who has engaged in rebellion against the government of Uganda since 1986 may apply for amnesty to prevent them from having to be punished for the crimes they've committed during conflict. Now, more practically, the Amnesty Act provides for the material needs of those people who are to be granted amnesty, because it gives them a package containing approximately 3 months' salary and a home kit, which includes a mattress, saucepans, blankets, plates, cups, maize, flour, and seeds. Now, amnesty is officially granted by the Amnesty Commission to children between the ages of 13 and 17. This is because the Amnesty Commission concluded that children 12 years of age could be held criminally responsible in Uganda. Now, children under 12 years of age have been excluded from the Amnesty Act, and all of this has raised serious concerns among child rights advocates who worry that granting amnesty to children would incriminate children who are the victims of insurgency, and particularly those, they say, who were abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army. The Amnesty Commission argued that granting amnesty to children over 12 years of age, on the other hand, was required to prevent them from facing criminal charges. Now, although there is no formal demobilization process for captured, escaped, or rescued children from the Lord's Resistance Army, the Amnesty Commission has implemented a series of DDR teams, demobilization and resettlement teams, which are responsible for the decommissioning of arms, demobilization, and reintegration of child soldiers. And there are 6 demobilization and reintegration teams that operate throughout northern Uganda. The other main means of DDR, and this is by far one of the most interesting things that I'm going to say tonight, is that the Uganda People's Defense Force, that is the Army of Uganda, recruits children into its ranks. And when ex-combatant children are captured by the UPDF, so when formerly abducted LRA soldiers are captured by the Uganda People's Defense Force, they're handed over to what the Army calls child protection units for debriefing and medical care. But it has become very clear that some children, instead of being sent onward for any DDR programming, are being absorbed directly into the ranks of the UPDF, the government army. This is not a new phenomenon, and there's a long record of ex-combatants being strongly coerced to join the UPDF. And this recruitment or absorption is seen by the government of Uganda as simply another means of carrying out DDR. So it's unclear as to how committed the government of Uganda actually is to carrying out DDR programs. The government has also implemented a number of development programs to assist in the rebuilding of northern Uganda. Yet the funding has been slow to come, and it has been doled out in a very much top-down manner, which has served to undermine efforts that were already underway at the community level. And there's been a lot of inefficiency, duplication, and waste. And people within the community have criticized this kind of development programming as a result. So a quick recap, the government has done 3 things: amnesty, DDR, and development, but it hasn't done any of these particularly well. So the bulk of efforts aimed at children and child soldiers are, in fact, carried out by NGOs, civil society organizations, and community-based organizations. For example, religious leaders in northern Uganda, rehabilitation centers, and traditional leaders have held sensitization campaigns within communities, often in IDP camps, where the majority of ex-combatants return to. Now, using things like prayer and traditional ceremonies, civil society attempts to promote the acceptance of returnees into the communities where they return. And this is of critical importance because the people in northern Uganda have been reluctant to accept these children back into their communities. So despite the fact that these children are children who come from these communities, they're seen as somehow tainted when they actually return to their communities. Humanitarian agencies, too, have developed several strategies that can effectively rehabilitate and reintegrate child soldiers, giving them much more expertise in this area than the government. That the majority of activities in Uganda are carried out by NGOs contradicts conventional thinking that governments bear the primary responsibility for protecting children from what Michel calls the scourge of war. Now, there are 2 main NGOs working in northern Uganda on programs for formerly abducted child soldiers. The first, Gulu Save the Children organization, or GUSCO as it's called, is a local NGO funded jointly by several international NGOs, including Save the Children in Uganda, the World Food Programme, and UNICEF. GUSCO was formed in 1994 as the first agency working toward the rehabilitation and reintegration of formerly abducted children. The center has a capacity for 50 children, but at the peak of the insurgency, it at one point housed as many as 287. The staff at Gusco carry out limited psychosocial rehabilitation of war-affected children, including activities like routine building and preparation for reunion with children's families. And at this stage, and I think this data might be a bit old, but it's the most recent they have on their webpage, 7,614 children have been resettled through the Gusco Center. Sorry, I hit another button. I wasn't sure where we were going. The other main reception center for child soldiers coming out of the bush is the Gulu Children of War Center, run by World Vision. Now, like Gusco, the World Vision Center focuses mainly on psychosocial counseling for former soldiers. It opened in 1995, and more than 15,000 children and adults have passed through the center. World Vision also operates 2 centers in addition to the Gulu Children of War Center, including the Child Mothers Center, mostly for girls who have been impregnated by soldiers in the war, in the bush with the Lord's Resistance Army, and an adult care center. There's mounting evidence, though, to suggest that a number of ex-combatants do not pass through either of the reception centers that I've talked about, or the other smaller centers that are in place. The fact is that children mostly don't know about the reception centers like Gusco and the Gulu Children of War Center, and so they often return straight home. But as well, the conflict in northern Uganda is changing, and so reception centers have had to begin to reconsider the scope and the nature of their work. And in fact, a number of other agencies are involved in the rehabilitation of ex-combatants outside of the formal reception center model. And especially important here is the work of grassroots organizations who have in fact carried much of the burden in the rehabilitation and reintegration of formerly abducted child soldiers. One of the best known groups is the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative, and this is a fantastic organization. It's a multi-faith group, has Muslim, Catholic, Anglican, Orthodox religious leaders. And they've been active in both advocacy on behalf of children and indirectly assisting them. And some of the delegation that you saw that went to Garamba were in fact the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative, including Father Carlos, who wore the beautiful red shirt. They have taken in children and sponsored many programs on their behalf, and in fact they were very involved with the night commuting phenomenon. When the army and the police would not go in to protect the children, the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative went, and the bishops slept with the children in those centers. Likewise, the Acholi traditional leaders, called Kekwaro Acholi, have played a strong role in the rehabilitation of formerly abducted child soldiers, and they've taken an active role in reintegrating children back into the community, in part through traditional cleansing ceremonies, which allow the Acholi to acknowledge that this person has been accepted back into the community and that the community is both willing and able to have them return. So I thought I would just describe one of these ceremonies, because many of you will never have heard of it. There's one ceremony called Mato Foot, and it's a very traditional ceremony where typically, if I had stolen John's goat, his clan and my clan might come together. We would sit and we would discuss the facts of what had happened. Our clans would determine that I was responsible and that perhaps I owed John some compensation. Our clans would come together to decide what that compensation should be, and everyone in the clan would contribute to that compensation for John's clan. And we would then sit together and take a meal. It would involve traditionally goats and chickens. And there's a big ceremony that goes around it, but at the culmination of that ceremony, the perpetrator, me, would drink a bitter tea or soup, and the bitterness would cleanse me, the perpetrator, from the bad things that I've committed. The elders would be there, the clans would come together, and the eating together would symbolize that we've reconciled between us. And in the audience tonight is Dave Clausen, who knows much more about these kinds of things than I do and has spent time in northern Uganda as well. But that's just one of the kinds of ceremonies that's carried out. Another is Noyo Tongweno, where when children have been away, they come back, and well, when anyone has been away, they step on an egg over a pobo twig, bamboo twig, And when the egg breaks, it cleanses the evil that has come with you from wherever you've been. And so these ceremonies have been carried out for hundreds of years, but they're now being applied in the context of the child soldiers who are coming back from the Lord's resistance army. And instead of one person perhaps passing over the egg and the apobo twig, you might have 100 or 300 children lined up and they go through it together. Likewise, they've modified the matofut, the drinking of the bitter soup, so that many people can be cleansed at the same time, because these ceremonies, although they're continuing to be used, have absolutely no basis in this kind of conflict, because the community has never known conflict on this scope or scale. So the Karkwaro Acholi, the Acholi traditional leaders, have used these kinds of ceremonies, and it seems like they have a lot of cultural relevance, and in some cases they have more cultural relevance than other activities. Now, together, the work carried out by this dense network of NGOs is effective and comprehensive. And yet, at the same time, the very presence of these NGOs allows the government of Uganda to take a hands-off kind of approach. And government of Uganda activities and efforts are so small as to be practically useless. And in the end, however it happens, a number of things need to be done to help the children of northern Uganda. But I sense that there's probably a lot that I've left unexplained and that you probably have a lot of questions. So I'm going to stop there and hope that I can answer some of your questions in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Opportunity for questions now. There is a mic here, so if you'd like to come to the mic, say who you are, and address your question to Dr. Quinn, and then we'll proceed from there.
You too. This is Alistair Edgar from Wilfrid Laurier University. Can you hear him at all? No.
Okay. My question, the little bit in the movie there with Ocampo from the ICC, an argument at the time was that the indictment issued by the ICC was one of the reasons why Kony wouldn't come out, and you're familiar with this discussion. And the government of Uganda has arguably been asking the ICC to hand the case back to them so that Kony might be persuaded to come out of the bush and they could try him or engage in some kind of traditional ceremony. The flip side of that, as Ocampo was suggesting, that Kony just uses these processes to get money from places like Bashir and Sudan to keep on funding him and re-equipping him. Do you think that the formal justice mechanisms, particularly the ICC, are getting in the way of peace in Uganda? Or is this something that needs to be done and Kony isn't serious anyway? Thanks.
Thanks, Alistair. You know, you go someplace and there's a ringer in the audience, that would be Alistair, I think. Because what Alistair didn't confess is that he's just come back from Uganda where he's actually studying this formal justice that's happening. And what he asks is a very good question that I'm asked quite a lot, because at play in Uganda have been a number of different processes of justice. So when President Museveni came to power in 1986, he put in place something called a Truth Commission. And you may be familiar with Truth Commissions from South Africa, where they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid. Museveni put one in place in 1986, which finished in 1994. But he has never done anything with the recommendations that came from that commission. Along the way, national courts have been able to try people like Joseph Kone, and Uganda has a big military and a big police force, which in theory could have done something to stop the conflict that Kone is involved in. In 2000, the Amnesty Act was put into place, and many people saw that as being the pivotal moment when Kone could be granted amnesty. He wouldn't have to face criminal prosecution or accountability, and so he was sure to come out of the bush. But that didn't happen, and the president became frustrated with that, and so shortly after that, the president referred the case of Joseph Kone and 4 of his deputies to Ocampo, that you saw, the chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, who has since unveiled a number of charges and arrest warrants, and yet nobody's bothered to catch Kone. And so the question, particularly in northern Uganda, has been, has the threat of prosecution, the threat of him being held accountable, kept Kone from doing things like signing the final peace agreements in 2008? And I think the answer has to be yes and no. I'm sorry, Alistair, but I'm going to equivocate here. Because the people in northern Uganda were already working on peace processes, and they felt that they were quite close to getting Kone to come out of the bush. And then the ICC came in, and since then, Kone might have been a bit reluctant to come out of the bush. But at the same time, the people who were working with Kone seemed to be negotiating on his behalf, and yet he seemed unaware of what it was that they were negotiating. So there was the negotiating arm called the Lord's Resistance Movement, which was their political wing. At the same time, the Lord's Resistance Army was still in the bush in Garamba and other places. And so even the negotiating that was done by the Lord's Resistance Movement, nobody is sure that Kone was on board with that in the first place. So Alistair, in answer to your question, nobody really knows what Kone knows or what he doesn't know. We know that Ocampo has made sure that an advance team has gone to meet with Kone, that members of the Lord's Resistance Movement delegation have been to The Hague, have talked to the International Criminal Court people. And in the end, I have to say, although I said I was going to equivocate, I think it probably has delayed justice, because this ICC thing being dropped into the middle of the community has really pushed everything else aside, and as the community has scrambled to understand what's going on, all of the other processes that were in place have sort of stalled. And so the Acholi Religious Leaders Peace Initiative with Father Carlos and others who have been to the bush, who have done things, Betty Bigombe, who initiated peace talks many years before the current peace talks were in place, those people have been working on a number of things that were stalled by the International Criminal Court. But I'm not sure that Kone has any incentive at all, even with amnesty or even without the International Criminal Court, to come in from the bush, because there's nothing in it for him. And the thought is that he can never go back and live in a community. Nobody would want Kone for a next-door neighbor, for example. The people who have been most affected are the people in the community where he would go to live. So, Alistair, the short answer is I don't know, but I don't think that the ICC has pushed off justice all that much in Uganda, because I think it was stalling for other reasons as well.
Please.
I'm short like you. I was hoping you could comment or educate more on who's been supplying Kone with weaponry for his army for the last 23 years and how that's been going on.
Okay. So the conflict in Uganda is complicated, no more so than conflicts in any other part of the world, but in Uganda, for example, Museveni began to supply the SPLA, the rebel army in the south of Sudan, with weapons to fight against the government in Khartoum in the north of Sudan. And so the government in Khartoum funded the Lord's Resistance Army to begin. We also know that the Lord's Resistance Movement, these people that I was talking about that were negotiating on behalf of Kone, are from the diaspora community. That is the community of Ugandans living outside of Uganda. And these are people who have fled over a number of years because of the conflict, who have become very educated and in some cases very wealthy. We know that the biggest diaspora contributors to the Lord's Resistance movement have come from the UK, but have also come from Michigan. And we know that they have been remitting money, supplies, and other things to Kone while he's been in the bush. So who's funding Joseph Kone? The diaspora community, the government in Khartoum, although apparently that funding has ceased. But we know that other actors are at play. There's some suspicion that Muammar Gaddafi from Libya is in fact funding some of the activities of the Lord's Resistance Army. He's very involved in different facets of life in Uganda, and other actors. So those are three that I can mention. Yeah.
Can you stand up and did you
I
hear
think
it?
the question was, are there thousands of people in the diaspora supporting? I have absolutely no idea. We know that there are lots of dollars and pounds and other denominations flowing in. I'm not sure that there's thousands, but we know, for example, that communities of what they called the Lord's Resistance Movement were meeting in London in the UK around the time that the International Criminal Court arrest warrants were unsealed. We know that there are big meetings of Uganda diaspora community people in Michigan and other places. So I'm not sure I would say thousands, but I honestly can't put a number on that community that would be funding, because we know that there are also diaspora members who don't send money to the Lord's Resistance Army.
Please.
Thanks very much. My name's Evan. I'm from the Foreign Affairs Society at the University of Waterloo. Just wondering if I could get a quick show of hands from everybody with FAS, I guess. My question has to do with the relative legitimacy between the LRA and the, I believe the acronym was the Ugandan People's Defense Force or whatever, where you said that both of these forces are using child soldiers. So how can you say that one force is more legitimate than another in light of a justice context with the ICC? Thanks.
Thank you. For the record, I did my undergrad at Waterloo, so I'm one of you. Or I was a million years ago. It's a very good question, and the legitimacy comes from the fact that one of those forces is recognized as the legitimate leader of Uganda. So the government of Uganda is also carrying out heinous acts, and one of the things that I may or may not have had on that slide is that the government of Uganda under Yoweri Museveni has also carried out a number of gross violations of human rights. So nobody's saying that the government of Uganda under Yoweri Museveni is perfect by any stretch, and in fact, one of the big criticisms that's been leveled against against the ICC arrest warrants is that the only charges are against Kone and his deputies, that Uganda government officials, including Museveni, including Rukana-Rugunda and others, should also have been charged by the ICC. One of the things that I didn't say, and maybe I shouldn't say, but I interviewed a guy called Julius who, this was 2006, Julius was trying to finish a master's degree in peace and conflict studies at Makerere University. And to look at Julius, he looked like a normal kind of guy, but Julius had been abducted in northeastern Uganda from his village in Iteso. His family had been caught in a series of conflicts that were going on. And remember I said there were 27 different armed insurgencies happening. One of the conflicts that's going on is with a group in the east, in the northeast, called Karamojong. And the Karamojong have faced a number of problems, a lot of them related to the environment, also related to the fact that at one point somebody brought them truckloads of AK-47s to fight against other rebels, which are still in use, which is complicated. Julius's family had been caught in Karamojong raids. So his grandfather, his mother, and his sister and her husband had been killed, and she was pregnant with a child, and that child was mutilated during that raid. Another raid happened, and UNRF forces came and abducted his sister as a sex slave. Another round of fighting happened, and Julius himself was abducted, but abducted by the Uganda People's Defense Force, conscripted as a soldier, and he was 12. Julius's two brothers were abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army, and one brother lives at home, now in a camp for the internally displaced, and he has HIV. So it's not as cut and dried as I've probably laid it out in the presentation. There are big conflicts going on around the country, and Museveni is certainly not innocent. He himself was fighting in the bush against a number of other things, a number of other fighting factions. He only came to power because he had more guns than anybody else at that time in 1986. So thanks for pointing it out, because Museveni is certainly not innocent either.
Hi, my name is Mary Lou Clausen, and lived in Uganda for a while, came back in 2004, so it feels like a long time already. And there's sort of two questions. I think you alluded to it, the first part of one. it's the context of the global war on terror. I'm curious to know if you see any sort of links to that sort of bigger context. And I suppose the other question that I keep coming to when I think about this is who is actually benefiting from this conflict?
Thanks, Mary. You see another ringer in the audience. The question about the global war on terror is a very interesting one, and there's a professor at the Lew Institute at the University of British Columbia. Her name is Erin Baines, and Erin has done a lot of work, and you may have seen some CBC documentaries that have been done on northern Uganda that Erin has been involved in. And Erin has done work with people like Lloyd Axworthy, and they were part of the group that convinced the United Nations that the conflict happening in Uganda wasn't just an internal conflict, that because it had spilled over the borders, it was then some kind of international security threat. And only then did the United Nations begin to take notice and even think about doing something. Is Uganda even on the radar for the global war on terror? Yes, because it was the first case selected by the International Criminal Court. Yes, because as you saw when they were signing those documents in the video that we saw, there was a man with an orange shirt. His name is Brian Burton, and he was the special envoy from Canada who was sent. He lived in a tent in Juba for close to 2 years on and off, waiting for all of those agreements to be signed and trying to cajole all of the stakeholders to come to the table. So in the sense that there's a group of 7 countries that's been funding the peace process in Uganda, it registers, and it registers in a big way because of the implications for terror. I just got an email today, and I didn't have a chance to look at it, but there's a group called Resolve Uganda, and the people that made Invisible Children have been really active with Resolve Uganda. And the email today said something about 173 days, and I think it's 173 days that they've been bringing petitions to Congress in the United States to point out that this war in northern Uganda, and now in Congo, and now in Central African Republic, has bigger implications that spill across the borders. And Mary, you'll have to forgive me because I've forgotten your second question. Oh yeah, who's benefiting? I don't know. It's hard to say. I spoke to an MP in 2004 from Lira, which is in northern Uganda as well, east and a bit south of Gulu, which we saw in the documentary. And her name is Cecilia Ogwal, and she's a force of nature, to put it mildly. And Cecilia Ogwal said to me, the only person benefiting from this conflict is Museveni. The people in the south are benefiting because, and I didn't have a map of Uganda to show you, but Uganda is almost very neatly divided in half by the Nile River, which runs across the middle of the country. The people in southern Uganda continue merrily on their way. They aren't affected in any particular way by this conflict. The people in northern Uganda are so busy worrying about the conflict that they don't pose any political opposition to Museveni. And so Cecilia Ogwal's answer was, the person benefiting is Museveni, and when he stops benefiting, he'll stop the conflict because it will become too expensive for him. And another weird little anecdote, in my life in Uganda, I sometimes teach at Makerere University in the Peace and Conflict Studies program. And the director of the program was a guy called Deus Nkurunziza. And Deus said to me, just after the election in 2008, something about the results of the election. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, it's interesting that everyone in the country has voted for Museveni, and yet the FDC is claiming to be an opposition party. And the government newspaper, the official government newspaper, had published a result that basically showed that everyone in the country had voted for Museveni. The opposition newspaper, the Monitor, instead printed a map that showed what they estimated the voting to have been based on exit polls and those kinds of things. And in the south of the country, it was painted red for Museveni and the movement. The north of the country was painted in blue for the FDC. Now, the election happened in February of 2006, not 2008, 2006. In August of 2006, I was in a sub-county parish office in Luero Triangle, which is just a little bit north of the capital. And I was talking to the sub-county parish chief about some things, and there were these boxes of Rubbermaid boxes in the corner. And so I said to him, Sebo, what's in the boxes? He said, oh, those are the ballots. And I said, pardon? He said, well, those are the ballots. I said, the ballots from what? He said, the election. I said, you mean the election in February? He said, yeah, the election in February. And I said, well, what are they doing? He said, well, we're waiting for somebody to come and pick them up. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we're waiting for someone to come and pick them up so they can be counted. At which point I whipped out my camera as the good political scientist that I am and went to take a picture, and I was quickly escorted out of the building. But we know that the election results cannot be entirely factual if sub-county parish offices have never counted their ballots. So who's winning? Cecilia Ogwell's answer is it's Museveni.
Question here?
First, thank you for speaking about this topic tonight, Dr. Quinn. We really appreciate it. My name is Paul Jones. I'm from McMaster University. And I was just wondering if you could comment on the health status of the internally displaced people. You had stated in your talk that there was approximately 1.8 million, 80% of northern Uganda as internally displaced. And you talked about the discrepancy in terms of the expenditures by the government on this population. Could you just compare and contrast maybe the differences between the north and the south in terms of health status?
Thank you. One of the things that the documentary pointed out was that 1,000 people at the height of the conflict were dying per week, living in the internally displaced camps from preventable diseases like cholera and dysentery and other things that we know how to treat. We know that during conflict, particularly in northern Uganda, the hospitals were running on sort of skeleton resources if they were able to operate at all. And so people's health care has suffered. People's health has suffered, and we know that when you're running from conflict, you maybe don't get the nutritional intake that you need every day. You maybe are forced to leave things behind. You're maybe forced to not eat at all. And this is the case of the people in northern Uganda. So people in the south of Uganda, relative to the north of Uganda, have fairly good access to health care. It's not great. It ranks near the bottom on all kinds of lists. But compared to the northern part of Uganda, the people in the south are doing reasonably well. I should say that the people who were living in those internally displaced people's camps have begun to return to their homes. Now that the conflict isn't as acute in northern Uganda, it's been easier for them to go. But when they go home, they find that they're unable to dig in their gardens for various reasons, insecurity, but also foodstuffs have disappeared, so it's not as easy to start growing cassava again or to grow maize or those kinds of things. And so people are in fact returning to the camps at night often because they can get nutritional supplements, bags of maize and rice and those kinds of things from the World Food Program. So it's going to be a short answer because I don't know a whole lot, but I do know that the people in northern Uganda are suffering still as a result of their confinement in the camps. We're seeing that children have really suffered from starvation, malnutrition, and those kinds of things, and those children are going to have lasting impacts from that as they grow. If you can imagine a society where children who are 20 years old and younger have never known anything but conflict and insecurity, and those people are going to go on to raise children of their own, not having the proper health care as they were growing up. Does that help?
I'll take the opportunity to ask a question.
Another ringer.
Is the problem of the LRA a one-bullet solution?
Can I say maybe? I think the Lord's Resistance Army, from what we know about it, and there are people like Sverker Finström from Sweden and Tim Allen from the United Kingdom who have done a lot more work on the Lord's Resistance Army itself than I have. People like Heike Behrend who have written on the LRA's predecessor, the Holy Spirit movement. But the work that has been done shows that Joseph Kone is very firmly in charge at the top. And so, John, if your question is, if we get rid of Kone, are we done? The answer is maybe. We also know that when Kone, the arrest warrants against Kone were unsealed, 4 other deputies, arrest warrants were unsealed for them as well, with a litany of crimes, including crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the list goes on and on. But shortly after those arrest warrants were unsealed, it became clear that 1 or 2 of the other top deputies had in fact died. When I was in Uganda it must have been August of 2006, there was a big headline, front page of both newspapers, that one of the other guys that had been indicted had died. And they, pictures of dead bodies splashed all over the front of the newspaper, and then a week or so later it was revealed, well, it wasn't actually him. So there's some confusion about, with Kone, is there anybody still left to be indicted? And the answer is there might be 1 or 2 of the other deputies. But the sentiment in Uganda is that it might not matter if those other deputies are indicted, because if you could get rid of Khan, as you say, the one-bullet solution, that maybe that would end the problem. Although there are other units of the Lord's Resistance Army fighting in various places. I think the answer is probably on the yes side rather than on the no side. I don't know. That's my guess.
Seeing no other questions, why don't we thank Dr. Quinn again.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to thank you all for coming out this evening and taking a few moments of your time to learn about this conflict alongside all of us. My name is Andrea Dyer, and I work for the nonprofit organization that made this film called Invisible Children. I wanted to let you all know that this film was made last year, but this conflict is obviously still very relevant. Just last week, 40 children were abducted in Central African Republic. In January alone, it's estimated that 400 children have been killed because of this conflict. But as well, the people in northern Uganda are very resilient. Anybody who's been there can probably tell you that. And this situation is not hopeless. In June 2009, Invisible Children held a lobbying event at the White House. Over 6,000 youth participated in that, and because of that event, the LRA Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act Bill of 2009 was born. And in regards to what Dr. Quinn was saying earlier about Resolve Uganda being in Oklahoma for over 176 hours, what happened is in January, this bill was hotlined for passage. For those of you who aren't familiar with DC talk, that means that the bill was deemed uncontroversial and would be passed unless a specific senator opposed it. Unfortunately, Senator Coburn is the only person in Oklahoma who opposed it, and so this bill has not been passed strictly because of him. So right now, as we speak, there are 40 activists hanging out in Oklahoma in Coburn's office, and they are not leaving until this bill is passed. So there's a lot of things happening. The international community is starting to stand up more and more and more for this cause, as are the youth, and it's very, very exciting. So I just didn't want anybody leaving here tonight feeling defeated and like there wasn't something that could be done. Not only through our nonprofit organization, I encourage all of you to visit resolveuganda.org. They are very, very heavy on the advocacy front, and they work closely alongside us to pass this bill and for anything politically related. As well, we have some merchandise for sale over here on this table. Know that if you decide to purchase a t-shirt or a DVD, you're supporting our microeconomic programs and you are putting kids in school. Those are the two things that we value most probably in our organization, is not only cutting this problem off at the root cause, but also supporting people who are enduring it and living through it day to day. You can also participate in our Try campaign or our Legacy Fund. Those are recurring donation programs. If you're interested in learning about those, I can definitely direct you and tell you a little bit more. And as well, when you leave here tonight, tell somebody about what you learned. If you purchase a DVD, show it to your family members, talk about this conflict, put it on people's radars, because that's ultimately, knowledge does cure, and it's the only thing that's going to really help us out with this conflict. So that is all I had to say. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and for everything.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And once again, I would like to, on behalf of CG, thank Dr. Quinn for your wonderful talk this evening, and we have a small token of appreciation on behalf of CG. Thank you very much, and safe travels home to our audience here tonight. Thank you.